The exact time and date in which our story begins are lost to the ages. But we can reasonably assume that the tale of Ark Raiders history truly begins sometime in the mid to late 21st century. Following the Industrial Revolution and subsequent Age of Information, civilization had advanced to a staggering degree. Earth is well and truly globalized. The world economy is booming, infrastructure continues to advance, and socially, there's a sense that the world has reached a state of singularity. It's the inevitable sort of future that many of us may envision today, chock full of advanced technology and advanced thinking. But just as in reality, this world comes at a cost. As is the case in many works of contemporary science fiction, the very height of man's achievements were contrasted with the exponential toll they exacted on the environment. There's an interesting phenomenon that seems to have occurred during this bygone age where computers, in spite or perhaps directly because of their ever-increasing power, began to grow in size, mirroring designs used in the late 20th century, and likely increasing the amount of material needed to produce them. Humanoid androids are known to have existed, supplementing a large part of the workforce, and they too would need to be crafted out of material extracted from the ground. These conveniences in and of themselves are indicative of the great strain of the age. Power, food, water, metals, plastics, oil, all things craved by an industrialized society, and all things consumed in greater abundance and with more recklessness than ever before in history. It can be no wonder, then, that ruin was on the horizon. The collapse, as it would come to be known, was likely the direct culmination of centuries of just this sort of environmental neglect and exploitation. All at once, this great age of innovation would come crashing down, and although details are murky on precisely what would occur during this relatively short age, even peoples in the present day of Ark Raiders recognize that the collapse, along with society's long overdue undoing, would be the product of natural disasters spurred on by man's own activities. Quote, "The collapse is said to have happened many generations ago, when devastating floods, scorching fires, and earthquakes conspired to rid the earth of her inhabitants. Only scattered societies are said to have remained, though after generations of darkness and decay, their tales have merged with legends and lies." Indeed, for one reason or another, the collapse would be the death knell to globalized living, spelling doom for many areas of the world which were not suited for self-reliance. In the first few weeks, millions are likely to have perished, and in the months, years, and decades to follow, billions. To this day, there is but one known place on the entirety of Earth's surface where human life is confirmed to have persisted, and that would be the southern portion of Italy. A location whose people would be fortunate in that they, through a combination of hard work and sheer luck, were able to evade the worst of the collapse through a set of unlikely contingencies. It's said that once the writing was on the wall for globalized society, there was an institutionalized effort by a small group of survivors to escape the inhospitable conditions of the collapse by escaping the Earth itself. To do this, they would erect and launch some of the largest spaceships ever created in a truly monumental effort of the sort only ever possible through desperation. In order to streamline work and facilitate the rapid construction of such technologically advanced vessels, a series of underground tunnels would be hastily excavated and used to ferry materials quickly and efficiently from all over the Italian countryside. The tubes, as they would come to be called, boasted cargo elevators and personnel hatches that connected to various areas of the surface, but all of which eventually led to one common area, the Asura spaceport, an area that stands today as one of Ark Raiders' most significant maps, at least in terms of lore. Now, virtually every lore-related source in-game is quick to mention the spaceport's association with this particular event. known officially as the Exodus, the time in which a daring few would board rockets to leave the Earth behind forever. Indeed, the area's central landmark, the infamous spaceport launch towers, were created for this precise purpose, launching specialized Exodus ships into the vastness of space, never to be seen again. However, though it's never officially mentioned, it seems rather likely that the spaceport did exist prior to this undertaking, and was merely appropriated for the Exodus project through a handful of new constructions as opposed to being built from scratch. Perhaps the most damning evidence for this is that the location sports separate facilities for both departure and arrival, insinuating that, prior to the collapse, the spaceport may well have been used for more traditional, even recreational means. Regardless, though, it is well documented that the Exodus program, hasty though it may have been, seems to have been a success, and some amount of human beings were able to flee into the great beyond before the worst of the ecological disaster would hit. What they would leave in their wake, however, was a trail of debris and remnants of unfathomable proportion, many of which still adorn the Italian countryside by the time of the game. And for the multitudes who had not had the fortune to leave the planet behind, decades or even centuries of hard-fought survival awaited in the now thoroughly polluted environment. For generations, this is how humanity endured. Those who survived the desperate lack of food or water, or were not killed by pollutants or environmental hazards, would muddle through life day to day, surviving in any way they could. Any and all first-hand memory of the pre-collapse world had long since been wiped from existence. But in their place, stories and myths were forged as generations of nomads would pick their way through the vast amounts of industrial waste now considered an inherent part of the landscape. As time marched on, even the name for Italy itself would disappear from the tenuous human zeitgeist and be supplanted by a new term, the Rust Belt, a name apt to describe the extraordinary amount of refuse inherent in this area of the world. However, dire and desolate as the region may have been immediately preceding the collapse, there was, at length, a sliver of hope. After more than a century of struggle, the biosphere would at last begin to stabilize. All of a sudden, the predominantly nomadic nature of mankind was no longer a necessity, and with the idea of a permanent settlement being once again possible, life in the Rust Belt would soon see a new renaissance of science, technology, and most importantly, hope. The Age of Sunrise had begun. If there's one event we can point to as the turning point for humanity in the post-collapse era, it's almost undisputably the rediscovery of the Dam, an area that virtually every Ark Raiders player ought to recognize. Prior to the collapse, this zone would have officially been designated the Alcantara Hydroelectric Power Plant, but when it was rediscovered by settlers in the Age of Sunrise, it would take on a new and perhaps more significant identity than ever before. Though the lake to the east of the dam stood dry and polluted with foreign contaminants, the marshlands to the west were left relatively unmarred, boasting lush plant and animal life and supplying a great starting point for settlers as they would begin exploring the possibility of a permanent colony. Using knowledge gleaned from old books, it wouldn't be long before surface dwellers established the series of hydroponic domes that still persist in the area today. Structures that, as their name suggests, would serve as testing grounds while humanity attempted to relearn the science of agriculture. Of course, the fractured nature of the settlers' rediscovered knowledge meant that their approach would consist of an odd melding of primitive and highly advanced techniques, resulting in some progressive oddities, such as how, at roughly the same time that they were first beginning to master hydroponics, they were also knee-deep in the development of a brand new genetically engineered strain of wheat. This same simultaneously primitive and advanced way of learning would go on to define basically any area of study or invention. When primitive weapons were developed, they didn't take the form of knives or spears, but rudimentary home-milled firearms influenced by the settlers' knowledge of the past. Similar effects could be observed in construction, with even the hydroponic domes themselves betraying a design principle similar to an advanced greenhouse, as opposed to more rudimentary building practices. all things considered, the people of the Rust Belt would have been, for the first time in a long time, right to be hopeful for the future. As settlements would expand outward to areas like the Buried City, a seemingly endless stream of new insights into the pre-collapse world were waiting to be discovered. Science was progressing again, the world was healing, and civilization, at least in some capacity, was well and truly prepared to move forward. This time with the foresight of the collapse, hopefully priming them to make better decisions than those who came before. But no sooner did the Age of Sunrise truly get underway than it would come to an unceremonious end. One day, without warning, and seemingly without cause, the first of the machines descended from the sky. Initially, curious settlers may have looked on in awe as mechanized creatures of unknown origin and design began to traverse the land, their numbers only increasing as new units would descend daily from the heavens, and when observed from a distance, they may have even seemed peaceful. But on closer inspection, the true nature of Earth's new robotic inhabitants would have immediately betrayed the unrelenting nature of what was to become man's greatest threat yet. The machines, dubbed arc for the arcing patterns they generated on radar scanners, would quickly become a primary and very active threat in and around all human settlements. Though they would come in various shapes, sizes, and with different apparent utilities, which we'll talk about a bit later, in principle, if not through overt action, Ark is, if nothing else, incredibly hostile to human life. And so it was that despite not even knowing from where the enemy originated, the settlers of the day would nevertheless be extremely quick in taking up arms to defend the world they had only just regained. Within a very short period of time, resistance would break out all across the Rust Belt, and while it's likely that the first skirmishes with Ark were solitary ventures, there was soon a more organized, militarized effort to drive out the mechanized threat. Thus began the First Wave, the earliest known war in post-collapse history. Now, at this point in time, discussion concerning what Ark was, or where it came from, had taken a back seat to defending oneself against it. But as many players will know, in the time since their initial appearance, the Ark have remained a very mysterious adversary. The question of where the machines originated from is one that is still asked to this day. But further examination of their habits, patterns, and design have led settlers to an unsettling conclusion regarding their purpose. See, the Ark network can roughly be divided into two sets of units. There are, of course, the designs used for offense, which we encounter most often when exploring in-game, but there are also various other machines, including probes and couriers, that, together, suggest that the main goal of Ark may be resource extraction. Perhaps one of the most on-the-nose examples of this is the Harvester, a triangular Ark module known for being guarded by the Queen. But there's also the apparently extinct Deforester, a massive tube-shaped machine whose name leaves similarly little to the imagination. The bottom line is that today, it's a widely held belief that the Ark have arrived on Earth specifically to strip it for resources. But the question that still remains is, for who? And if you've been paying attention so far, there's an obvious candidate that seems to fit the bill. Many players believe that Ark must be connected to the settlers who escaped the Earth during the Exodus. And in fact, there's even been the idea posited that these mysterious wayfarers weren't just normal, everyday individuals, but that the program was instead carried out by the most elite members of pre-collapse society. In other words, the idea that billionaires and business moguls could have polluted the Earth beyond repair only to flee into space, leaving the rest of humanity behind to clean up their mess, is one that is actually supported very strongly within the framework of this game. And if this is the case, then perhaps it's no surprise that those same escapees would think to send back machines and take even more just as the biosphere was beginning to stabilize. All of this is merely a theory, and it's not even an in-universe theory, but rather one that only really makes sense given the information we have as players. There's almost no chance nor evidence that this could ever have been conceived by settlers during the first wave, and besides, as we've already discussed, they were fairly preoccupied anyway. It's no surprise that many of the Ark machines of the first wave were somewhat different in form and function to the iterations that we have today. Thanks to a very specific trial challenge made available to players in January of 2026, we know that most, if not all, of the destroyed husks scattered about topside by the time of the game hail from the first wave conflict. And upon closer inspection, many of them, even the Ark that do correlate one-to-one with a present model, exhibit substantially more rudimentary construction. With little more than makeshift weapons, the settlers were successfully able to hold their own, at least for a time, but where one machine fell, another would soon descend to take its place. Based on evidence from the surface, probes, drones, and aerial machines seemed especially prevalent during this period, but it was the arrival of a new type of Ark that would first have turned the tides of war in favor of the invaders from above. Barons were a variety of large walker-style machines that proved especially deadly. We're told that at the time of their appearance, the Barons were the largest variety of Ark ever identified, armed with rocket launchers, explosives, and other mounted arms, and fed by a pressurized engine core which ran so hot that even cracking open a Baron husk in the modern day risks triggering a potentially deadly meltdown sequence. For most of the first wave, the Barons were seen as nearly insurmountable, walking armadas whose sheer size and broad arsenal made them prohibitively taxing to even attempt to confront, and because of this, a culture of avoidance was established, allowing the Ark to advance on most established outposts and settlements virtually unchecked. Eventually, and after years of fighting, there were some successes felling even these mighty machines, but it simply wasn't enough, and in time there was only one major POI which still held fast on the human side. Of all the emergent populations in the Rust Belt, perhaps none were as staunch and stalwart in defense of their home as those in the Alcantara Dam region. And the reasoning for this seems clear enough. The dam was, after all, universally hailed as the cradle of modern civilization, the place where humanity had taken their first steps forward in the post-collapse era. There was just nowhere else in the Rust Belt more practically nor symbolically sacrosanct, and it came to be believed that if the dam fell, humanity would fall along with it. It was perhaps this desperate outlook that would set the scene for the first wave's incredible and brutal finale. After nearly a decade of non-stop combat, the population surrounding the dam had become scattered. Though small pockets of settlers remained around the region, Ark machines now fully surrounded them and permeated even the marshlands. Indeed, one of the most fit fighting forces still in existence, commanded by First Wave veteran Major Ava, had been forced due south toward a spine of rocky outcroppings overlooking the greater zone. Up until this point, the territory here had not served any major purpose. In fact, it's not even known if the outcropping itself had a name, though it did house the Formicae Outpost, a notable position out of which the remaining fighters were operating, though a fortress which had hardly been devised as a front-line encampment. Even to the skilled fighters, the position seemed dire. Territory on all sides was crawling with Ark, and although disparate pockets of soldiers and settlers remained, presenting any sort of unified front would be extremely difficult. Though, as Major Ava would recognize, not impossible. As stated before, Ava was an experienced fighter, combating Ark for years during the first wave and waging several successful campaigns against hordes of machines, up to and including the mighty Baron. So, given her propensity for tactical intelligence, it's perhaps no surprise that under her leadership, by the time Ark forces began funneling into the foothills, snipers and infantrymen were already in position. And although many hundreds or even thousands of raiders would perish, including Ava herself, the Major's push worked. And for the first time in over 10 years, Ark was driven out of the dam battlegrounds entirely. In commemoration of the event and in remembrance of the lives lost, the site of the turmoil would be dubbed Victory Ridge, and settlers would hoist flags as symbols of their successful reclamation. One of the battle's most significant impacts was that it also, consequently, resulted in the total extinction of barons in the Rust Belt, although they are insinuated to exist elsewhere on the surface of Earth even to this day. Regardless, with the largest threat wiped from the playing field, it wasn't long before Ark was cast out of other nearby areas, resulting in a brief interim of peace mirroring the Age of Sunrise. For several years following this point, humanity would see a return to several of the activities of the prior age. One of the areas that proved to be of great interest following the first wave was none other than the Buried City, as now more than ever, settlers desired to discover more about pre-collapse life and technology. Interestingly, it was soon discovered that much of the city itself was left completely preserved, buried beneath layers of rock and sediment, which would all too soon prove to be an invaluable asset. Ark did not stay away for long. It's unknown exactly what the duration of this era of peace would have looked like, but in less than a generation, the Ark would return, and in spectacularly destructive fashion. The second wave took settlers by surprise much as the first had. Machines fell from the sky all across the Rust Belt in greater abundance than ever before, and bearing new weapons and implements of destruction never before seen on the battlefield. Indeed, this new generation of machine, the ones we see by the time of the game, are sleek, polished, and come in a broader variety of forms than ever imagined previously. Some units, used for direct combat, are armored and boast new systems capable of rooting out human life wherever it may hide, while improved reconnaissance reinforces the skies with ruthless efficiency. And with units like the Queen and the dreaded Matriarch introduced into the fray, even the Baron, the once revered symbol of destruction in the first wave, appears as little more than a prototypical plaything. Ark's second attack on humanity was swift and relentless. Unlike during the first wave, life on the surface was now deemed completely unsustainable, and in their haste to escape the fray, virtually all survivors would make their way underground, retreating into bunkers, subsurface tunnels, and many even taking up residence in that preserved portion of the buried city. While this last-ditch option would allow for successful avoidance of the Ark above, though, the people of the Rust Belt were once again disconnected, scattered throughout disparate burrows. Their forces divided, and many of their technologies lost. It seemed likely that this could be the end of the line. Or at least, this very well could have been the case were it not for the seemingly miraculous rediscovery of an unlikely boon left behind from a bygone age. As it would happen, when the settlers of the Rust Belt descended beneath the earth, many of the pockets of underground infrastructure they slipped into were those previously used during the Exodus, and as a result, they would have been connected to the tube network, used at the time to quickly transport materials to the spaceport. Even after all this time, much of that infrastructure had been untouched, and before long, what started as a loose network of small underground communities had grown into a vast subterranean city. Its name? Toledo. By the time that Ark Raiders takes place, the second wave has long been upon us, and although small pockets of settlers are suggested to exist topside, the colloquial term used to refer to the surface world, the vast majority of Rust Belt citizens now reside underground. Although separated by somewhat vast geographic distances, Toledo is composed entirely of found subterranean structures, retrofitted to serve as permanent neighborhoods and residences. Officially, these pockets of civilization are called contradas, and they range drastically in size and population, from small bunkers serving only a handful of people, all the way up to that preserved portion of the buried city, which today houses many thousands of settlers and is known by a familiar name, Speranza. Indeed, Speranza is in many ways the core location from which the broader city of Toledo sprouted, not only being its oldest neighborhood, but also its most well-equipped, and by a considerable margin. It's said that despite benefiting from a consolidated network of utilities, including electricity and water purification, many of which are distributed by Speranza to many of the other contradas in Toledo, much of the rest of the city's smaller neighborhoods still struggle with subpar living conditions. While hidden planting locations scattered around the surface do provide small amounts of food, much of Toledo's resources, whether natural or mechanical, come from scavenging, and it's this budding industry that truly sets Speranza apart as a sort of de facto capital city. Raiders, as they're called, are explorers who serve a multifaceted role in modern Toledo society. Making a living from venturing topside, these brave settlers are at once the city's primary source of foreign materials and resources, and serve as the primary fighting force against the treachery of the second wave of Ark. By this point, the age of large-scale regiments, as were somewhat popular during the first wave, have gone by the wayside. And instead, raiders today employ more guerrilla tactics, picking off individual Ark, scavenging them for parts, and bringing those parts below, where a network of traders and black market dealers put them to use throughout the rest of Toledo's networks. The advancements in Ark have therefore also catalyzed further advancement in human capabilities. The trader Tian Wen, the daughter of the late Major Ava, for example, is credited with using Ark technology to revolutionize the world of firearms. And today, it's common to see raiders equipped with one of her guns alongside a standard energy shield, a piece of tech similarly pioneered and made possible through the reverse engineering of Ark components. It's within this very arms race that we find ourselves when our raider first arrives in Speranza, and which defines the entire struggle of Ark raiders as a whole. It's unclear for how long the second wave will rage, nor who will go on to be the victor, but if there's one consistent theme throughout the entirety of our story so far, it's the relentless spirit of human ingenuity. This, at least in my opinion, is what makes the world of Ark as vibrant as the actual game itself. At the end of the day, as much as it's tempting to see the world of Ark Raiders as a tragic one, rooted in an apocalyptic collapse of civilized life, this sentiment directly contrasts with the enduring sense of possibility and hope so prevalent elsewhere in game. This is a story about many things. It's a tale of man versus machine, resistance versus establishment, and may even serve as an allegory for the nature of trust and conflict as a whole. But the parts that myself and many others seem to remember the most are the collaborative moments, the times when raiders realize that they can accomplish more in unity than they ever could apart. And so, here we are, preparing once again to head to the surface. It's a scary job, but if nothing else, with every victory, with every defeat, we only add to the legacy of that enduring spirit. This is Everbron, and have a good one.